Hi, I'm Krista Mary Mack, a UTEP MPA student, unfortunately not joining you all this evening other than virtually. This capstone presentation is a case study design summary, investigating the efficacy of the microtowns, which are not counties or cities, but found across and adjoining counties and cities of the U.S. in the form of military joint bases. So a little bit of background is needed. 20 years ago now, 26 U.S. military installations were, on paper, combined into 12. The merger of these bases was congressionally mandated by the 2005 Commission of Base Realignment and Closures, commonly referred to as BRAC. The merges were all completed on schedule by 2011. Most bases, like Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Hawaii, are adjoining. However, 4 of the resulting joint bases are not geographically connected. This case study investigates one of these geographically dispersed joint bases, Joint Base Langley-Eustis, Virginia. It evaluates post-merging and assesses what works better because of these merges and what improvements can be applied to the challenges of joint bases. So if you look at this map of the region, you'll see up here on the right that Joint Base Langley-Eustis, commonly referred to as JBLE, is on the East Coast, about 3 hours south of Washington, D.C., and 20 miles or so north of Norfolk and Virginia Beach. The Army base, Fort Eustis, is on the left with the blue outline, and Langley Air Force Base is in the center there. You see it in the city of Hampton. And see that space between Eustis and Langley? They are separated by 18 miles. Here's some more information about JBLE from the perspective of the Joint Base Public Affairs Office.
There's 12 joint bases in the Department of Defense. This one is by far the greatest.
So, as we're told in this video, this one place is all these things, which brings us to our problem. So, JBLE is technically one place, but it is 2 very distinct entities, with people who work and live at each that find themselves very much separated, just as you saw on that map. There are separate grocery stores, separate personnel offices, fire stations, and much more. Several agencies and operations are mutual with similar needs, and as you can see from this list here, everything a small town needs, both places need. Additionally, JBLE combines duplicate services, plus there are different operational needs for each installation. For example, Langley has tenants such as NASA Research Center and a fighter squadron. Eustis has a port with boats and military rail. So there are some very different needs. The main research question is, 15 years after combining 26 individual military installations into 12 joint bases, does joint basing at Joint Base Langley-Eustis improve or further complicate operational efficiency and unity compared to maintaining separate installations, considering the financial, social, regional, and logistical factors? So here are some of the major references in the study broken down by topic. First, some examples of the BRAC-related literature, and then merger and acquisition research. Like here in Managing Collisions Between People, Culture, and Organizations, Bono and Bowditch write about the cultural struggles of assimilation and the impact in their 8 years of merger and acquisitions research. And then there's quite a bit of joint base research where one example here, Fiacco and Stevens conducted a comparative analysis of joint bases between services, and they compared Joint Base San Antonio, which is led by the Air Force, to Joint Base Lewis McChord, which is led by the Army. Christopher Clanahan has published several peer-reviewed studies regarding joint bases, and one of the two listed here, he investigated defense communities implementing the Joint Land Use Study, and he engaged community stakeholders from 55 sites across the U.S. Given also the nature of the topic, it was necessary to research a whole lot of numerous government papers and websites, federal and regional. So for data and methodology, JBLE is the case with this case study. Sources used are the UTEP library, other libraries, Google Scholar, Department of Defense, and congressional papers. Criteria used includes persistent observation and triangulation, with much reliance on secondary data. Interviews were a combination of balance, seeking parallel examples from both bases, leadership from Army, Air Force, and civilians, like these guys here serving a holiday meal in the image, examples of broad representation. The intent was to give a cross-case analysis and a qualitative view, representing a varied sampling of perspectives. And then for data, you see the annual impact statement here, an example of from the 2024 annual impact statement, air installation compatible use, joint land use study, and what's released on the official website also. See the airman here at the top and then the soldier at the bottom? Everyone has to do some heavy lifting. By examining mergers and acquisitions literature and analyzing processes and indicators of successful mergers, non-military merger guidance can be applied to improve the consolidation. So this finding, according to Weber and Kammerer, most mergers fail in every sense, and often that's related to a lack of cultural integration. In a 2003 study of 156 companies across North America, Europe, and the Asia-Pacific regions, this was conducted over 6 months. Researchers concluded that the most detrimental barrier to successful partnerships is the difference in organizational culture. So to the outside eye, the U.S. Air Force and Army they're both military, they're sister services, but they're still very separate organizational cultures with very different procedures, operations, and expectations. Therefore, integration of organizational culture is needed for success. So financial differences. Each year, the National Defense Authorization Act breaks down annual appropriations, what amount each service is allocated to personnel, procurement, operations, and research. The part of that funding that goes to each service is called Base Operation Support, or BOS. And the Congressional Budgeting Office found the strongest cost related to BOS is size, regarding particularly the number of employees and amount of space a base has for building. According to the 2024 Economic Impact Statement, the economic impact of JBLE grew to $4.51 billion in fiscal year 2024. That's an increase of about nearly $1 billion since fiscal year 2022 impact statement. And that statement includes the 20,884 civilian and military personnel combined. So what I just said, a limitation immediately evident here is how well the funding between the individual service is just not considered. So this information is presented as the joint base as a whole and not like with the two separate pieces. And so that aspect needs further inquiry and could absolutely benefit from a cost analysis. Separate versus joint functions. Imagine two similarly sized cities within the same county, but one of the cities runs both. How might you feel if your city was managed by a separate neighbor city? One shared responsibility for both installations, in that sense, is security. Langley and Eustis use a combination of civilian police officers, U.S. Army military police, and Air Force security forces. The organization somehow keeps itself separate, yet also connected with the leadership at Langley. So, for example, each year, both Langley and Eustis celebrate National Night Out in August, where fire trucks, police cars, and emergency management have this family-friendly event at their respective installations simultaneously. So that's something they do together while being separate. But if a school group needs a visitor pass to both Langley and Eustis in the same day, two separate forms need to be submitted to two different offices with the exact same information to visit. Meanwhile, both forms at each location are submitted to the same database for approval. So two completely separate forms with identical information must be separately submitted from each installation to gain approval from the same database to go to, hypothetically, this one joint base, right? So many respondents detailed similar complications, and they were often due to duplications of efforts like this. Turns out the region is saturated with military installations, so the civilian population and military population are so integrated, they're not really two separate entities. There are 15 military installations in the greater Hampton Roads region, which is the term for the 7 cities in that like about an hour region. And the communities are very integrated with neighborhoods and schools filled with military-connected children. Despite this integration of military, acculturation remains. Everyone thinks basically, hey, each service think that their service is the best. And McClure's study combined and compiled several studies of military neighborhoods, and always this was the result. In the interviews, respondent number 7, a senior civilian leader at Fort Eustis, spoke at length about the challenges of optimization, a term he said referred to improving efficiency and effectiveness, and it's also a blanket term for all the original goals of the BRAC. So for limitations, the longest U.S. government shutdown in history was right in the middle of this research. In addition to the shutdown, it's been a tumultuous year for federal service, rifts, retirements, lapse in appropriation, a hiring freeze since February. So respondents may have different feelings to express than they would in a normal year. Another issue, the only data released to the public is what is available for this study, and the data that's released, as we said earlier, is released together, not separately, showing the difference between Langley and Eustis. Also, this study could have compared more than one joint base, like the JBLM versus JBSA study. On paper, especially according to the impact statements, the cost savings and enhancement of military value has been presented in many formats. However, according to those who work at both installations interviewed, the transformation and capabilities are not necessarily more efficient or streamlined. Most interviewed respondents had at least one story of an overly complicated process that was often part of their daily work. Each person having a double or triple efforts due to more complicated process, each attempted to translate, connect, and achieve solutions. Of all the respondents from the interviews, a consensus remained that it did not matter if they thought joint basing was a good or bad idea, but that everyone strove to accomplish their individual jobs as best they can. Cultural integration can be hard, especially with active military often moving to their next installation every few years, but the continuity of that third culture, primarily civilian employees that understand and connect both sides, is that integration. Ultimately, no matter the outcome, more investigation into the status of joint bases is needed, and doing so can only improve processes. As 2025 is the 15-year mark, planning such as a 20-year BRAC investigation or planning a checkup every 5 years with the same information collected for comparison is what's recommended. The world of the joint military base truly is somewhat like a mostly self-sufficient county, but with one of the cities running everything. It's a complicated world, but a functioning one. According to the installation's motto, Joint Base Langley-Eustis is a great place to work and live and play. It's a world unto itself. Thanks for listening.